Thank you. Hi. Yeah. So there's a I see there's a conference here to the month. So you might be speaking. I'm not, but you're not similar topic. Yeah. Yeah, I remember last I'm hearing what you have to say.
Well, the negative.
Yeah.
The negative.
Okay, welcome back after lunch. We're going to start session 3, subtitled Early Days. The first speaker is going to be Xavier. He's going to talk on the West Australian legacy of slavery and imperial wealth. Welcome and thank you. Oh, it's the technology. Yeah, that button. Yep, that's that.
Thanks everyone. Hi, I am Xavier. I work as a research assistant in history as part of the West Australian British Slavery Project. So I'm a bit academic history zone, but hello. To start off, I just want to acknowledge and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging that we are on Labrador land. And I'm presenting my paper, West Australian Legacies of Slavery and Imperial Wealth, examining the Swan River land returns of 1829 to 1830. So colonial Western Australia, from its origins of the Swan River colony founded in 1829, has long been attached to a foundational myth of being built upon free labour and investments that were unstained by slavery, transportation or other colonial schemes. The land of the Swan River, as we know, was appropriated by the British and set up as a colony funded mostly by private investment, with titles to land granted in fee simple assigned in proportion to the amount of capital investment that was introduced to the colony. So the formula for this was simple. For every £3 of capital imported, 40 acres of land would be granted accordingly. And these investments included things like livestock, tools and seats, but also included monetary values assigned to people and servants, considered as human capital for their ability to perform useful labouring functions. So far, the origins of the private investments that underpin the foundation of the Swan River, which, when you take it together, accounted for vast swaths of private investment and wealth, have managed to pass by largely unscrutinised and unchecked. The aims of this paper are simple. First, I offer a re-examination of the land returns to identify and quantify the vast wealth that founded the Swan River colony. Second, I consider these investments as positioned and entangled within a more global major economic shift, that being the economic effects surrounding the gradual abolition of slavery in the British Empire and the subsequent reorientations of wealth, divestments and investments towards the new settler colonies, such as Western Australia. Through this paper, I aim to answer several key questions. What was the total private investment made in the formative years of the Swan River colony? From where did this wealth derive? Which early colonists and their associated wealth had demonstrable links to slavery? And what imperial antecedents did the methods of valuation used in the Swan River land branch have? To accomplish this, I undertake a quantitative analysis of the private investments of the Swan River colony and quantify a few of these key financial parameters. So what do these documents that I'm using actually look like? What are the archival sources? So there are two main documents and one informs the other. The first, shown here, is the return of property, which is a register that lists the initial colonists that claimed land in the Swan River, the amount of property and investments that they brought to the colony, and its assessed monetary value as it was determined by the Colonial Office. So for instance, in my red box here, we've got George Leakey, who was accompanied by one child, 2 friends, 5 servants, and had his property, amongst all these various categories up there, valued, at least that which was deemed applicable to the cultivation of land, at 1,116 pounds square foot sterling. The second source is the returns of land, which lists the amount of land that each individual was granted based on their assessments in the first source. So you can see here that I also identified George Leakey in this document, And so for his investments on document 1, he was granted 20,907 acres in the Swan River. So when we conceptualize the Swan River colony, we often don't think about it as being connected to more global imperial processes relating to the gradual abolition of slavery. So for context, while the British slave trade was abolished in 1807 and the Slavery Abolition Act passed in 1833, slavery largely persisted until 1838. During these decades, while slavery and associated industries were really on the way out in the world and falling out of favour, the wealth and future investment prospects that were tied up in the West Indian colonies were actively in the process of becoming far less profitable. Individuals began to look to the new settler colonies for potential opportunities for both divestment and reinvestment, including the Swan River colony. And the Swan River was particularly attractive to potential investors due to the generous terms of granting land and the lack of capital outlay that it required. And as Governor James Sterling observed of the initial colonists, it was a group that comprised of, quote, more than the usual number of men of property. As I will outline, many of these men did have connections to slavery and slavery-related wealth. This wealth, at least in part, would have accompanied them to the Swan River, and it may also be reflected within the records of the Land Returns Register. So what has the literature said so far with regards to the land returns? Well, Pamela Sasson, who I'm drawing on quite a lot here, has found that the valuing of investments for land grants were not clearly specified, which led to a liberal interpretation and approach to asset valuation by the Colonial Office. And other scholars, such as James Cameron, has found that the price of land at Swan River was comparatively cheap. But in contrast to Statham, has found that the Council of Audit applied a consistent standard of investment valuation. And lastly, Michael Burke has noted that the investments were assessed and land was subsequently granted using, quote, a very rough and ready method. And as we can see from the register, the source only gives a total per colonist, but does not give us a grand total for all individuals. So you can see by this red box at the bottom that this is blank. Quantitative analysis allowed for several figures to be determined. So the total of all capital that was deemed applicable to the cultivation of land during these years, the total of various categories, so for instance, the total value of human capital or any other categories that were listed on the ledger. And in addition to calculating both the capital that was deemed applicable to the cultivation of land and that which was deemed not applicable to the cultivation of land. But most importantly for my analysis, the grand total of investment came to a total of 94,118 Great British Sterling pounds, or at least for 1820 and 1830. So in itself, this figure represents a massive amount of total investment. But what it does not reflect is the tremendous purchasing power that this amount of capital held within the specific context of the Swan River colony, particularly when compared to its relative purchasing power both in the metropole or within other British colonies. To take, for instance, the example of early colonist to the Swan River, Thomas Henty. In 1794, in Sussex, Henty had purchased 294 acres of land for £12,800. At the Swan River, Henty claimed over 84,000 acres of land for £6,332, with no capital or cash outlay. But in relation to average earning capacity, this total capital investment of over £94,000 represents over 2,000 times the annual average British worker's wage. And while acknowledging that retrospectively equating capital to a contemporary equivalent remains both contentious and problematic, this grand total of investment, at least according to the Bank of England's historical inflation calculator, equates to 8,286,284 Great British pounds today, which is well over 14 million Australian dollars. But we might temper this by considering the fact that this investment remained mostly highly theoretical in nature. For one, this money was not liquid. And for another, many grants were not able to be adequately improved in order to gain their title and were therefore returned to the Crown. Many fortunes were also lost entirely through the new colonial venture. And here we might be familiar with the examples of Thomas Peel or Peter Augustus Latour, the latter of whom went completely bankrupt by his venture in the Swan River, and he ended up in a debtor's prison. Other investments, however, were very successful. For instance, George Leakey, who I used as my example before, was not only able to improve his grant and gain its full title, but his investments, including his merchant enterprise at Fremantle and his underwriting of the mortgages of many other colonists in the Swan River, provided him with profits that transformed him into one of the richest men of the colony. But returning to the Land Returns Register, I want to draw specific attention to one category, that of servants and servants' children. This column refers to, as I mentioned before, of human capital. So this is the value assigned to people, largely indentured servants, for their ability to perform useful labouring functions. Most obviously, although perhaps somewhat superficially, labouring individuals are recorded within the register as numbers without names and were ascribed explicit financial values, bearing many similarities to the registers of slaves, who were similarly recorded as numbers and values. The method of assessment also recognised the value of both women and children, much like how in the British colonies and in the metropole, and indeed within systems of slavery more broadly. The capacity of children to labour and women to serve as a source of reproductive labour did not go uncommodified. And the total value of human capital assessed within the register is a total of £6,184, which reflects a monetary worth of 420 people, 57 of which were children. We might also consider other similarities to slavery with this valuing of human capital, such as the fact that these individuals are only described in direct relation or ownership to a master. Moreover, individuals of the labouring and servant classes, mostly indentured, were disproportionately brought to the Swan River colony by only the wealthiest of colonists. James Cameron has identified that 4/5 were tied to colonists whose investments were values of £500 or more. So, through drawing attention to the recording of capital within the register, I argue that this valuing must be considered as a mode of valuing that was important to the Swan River and remains very closely attached, or perhaps developed from, the valuing of slaves that were present in other imperial spaces. So, as shown earlier, the assessments of investments, which determine how much land each individual was entitled to receive, is a separate document to the register that lists the amount of acres that were actually granted. When you compare the two, the theoretical entitlement versus the actual number of acres granted reveals a significant discrepancy. The number of acres granted did not always reflect the policy price of 40 acres granted for every £3 of investment. And in theory, the largest grant should always correlate to the largest capital investments. However, this was not the case. So in order to interrogate this, the amount of acres that each colonist should theoretically have been entitled to was calculated and then cross-referenced against the actual number of acres that they received. The database I constructed showed that, firstly, 94 out of 144 colonists, or 65%, received a grant that was within £5 of their capital investment. These ones are all shown in green. In other words, the theory of 40 acres as being granted for every £3 of investment checks out, but only 65% of the time. 7 of the 44 colonists, or 5%, received grants that were smaller than their capital investment, and these are the few that are in the colour in white. But most importantly for my analysis, 24 of the 144 colonists, or 16%, received grants that were at least 20% or more than their investment, and these are in red. What's more, when the grants exceeded their capital investment, they often did so by the equivalent of many hundreds of pounds of additional value. So who received more than their theoretical entitlement? Well, there's a few, which I'm going to name drop. First is Captain Richard Goldsmith Mears, who received a grant worth £853 more than his investment entitled him to, which was the biggest bonus of the returns of these years, whilst George Leakey, who has served as our example, received an additional £453 of value. Charles Brown followed closely behind with a grant £415 greater than his capital investment, and the list goes on. In fact, there's a total of over 11 other individuals that were granted, had their actual acres granted at more than £100 worth of unentitled value. And this kind of begs the natural question, how might we explain these discrepancies? What other factors might have been at play? One factor that I'm exploring through my work as part of the West Australian British Legacies of British Slavery project is that of slavery. Several individuals in the register have already been identified as people who were beneficiaries of slavery compensation themselves, or were born into families who had accumulated their wealth through slavery or slavery-related enterprise. These include Peter Pegasus, the son of a slave owner who received compensation for the Hermitage estate, Grenada, Charles Dawson Ridley, who was an administrator of at least 3 estates in Demerara, and James Walcott, who owned several plantations in the West Indies. And all these individuals appear within the Legacies of British Slavery database, which was devised by the University College London a few years ago and identifies individuals that were beneficiaries of slavery compensation. These individuals, all of these individuals, after their lives and careers in the West Indies, would later emigrate to the Swan River, accompanied by large amounts of capital. But my research has also uncovered several new and previously unidentified links to slavery or to slavery-derived wealth. These individuals appear in the Land Returns Register, bringing money, labour, and items applicable to the cultivation of land, but also brought ambitions of new colonial ventures and profit ready to be transplanted onto a new imperial space, that of the Swan River. So to outline some of these individuals, there's George Dunwich, for instance, who was the grandson of Thomas Dunwich. He was a joint owner of a large plantation in East Florida called New Switzerland, when Florida was still under British rule. New Switzerland was a vast plantation covering over 15,000 acres, which later developed a reputation for being one of Florida's most prominent plantations. George Dunwich himself invested over £2,500 in the Swan River colony, which included £500 worth of cash. His investment represents the 6th largest investment of capital, and for his investment, Dunwich was granted over 20,000 acres in the Swan River. One must wonder whether George's aspirations in the Swan River were at least partially informed by his grandfather's very successful plantation enterprise just a few decades prior. And early colonist James Summers Ray also came from a similar background. Whilst his investment in the Swan River and in land returns shown earlier in the wider context does not draw one's attention, as he invested a relatively unexceptional £482. His uncle, William Ray, was a large-scale slave owner with across several parishes in Jamaica. In his will, dated 1834, he bequeathed his properties across England, Scotland, and Jamaica, and his apprentice labourers attached, which referred to ex-slaves, amongst several of his nephews and nieces, and this may have included James Summers, our colonist of the Swan River. And the list goes on. For instance, Captain Mark John Curry, who arrived on the Parmelia in 1829, was the nephew of Isaac Curry, who appears in the Legacies of British Slavery database, which I showed earlier, for several estates in St. Mary in Jamaica. When you put his claims together, they reach a massive total of over £15,000. And upon Isaac's death in 1858, he had a total of 200,000 Great British pounds to his name. And much of the Curry family's wealth stemmed in origin, if not from slavery directly, but perhaps indirectly, from the family banking venture Currys & Co., which was established in 1773 by Mark's grandfather, William Curry. And the bank was sufficiently embroiled in slavery-related industries and financing of slavery to earn itself a specific identification within the Legacies of British Slavery database. And again, whether any of this wealth went its way to Mark or to the Swan River directly does remain speculative. But assuming that at least part of the Curry's wealth and associated with slavery made its way to the Swan River is not necessarily that much of a stretch, as Marx's cousin, Raikes Curry, also turned to the Australian colonies for the reinvestment of capital, in his instance, to the South Australian colony. And Raikes, along with his capital, helped found the foundational South Australian Land Company. So while Raikes did not emigrate personally to the Swan River as Mark did, it's worth pointing out that Mark's capital was sufficient to assure him a substantial grant of over 12,000 acres within the Swan River colony. And lastly, Robert Dale, who was also amongst the earliest colonies, was granted just shy of 4,500 acres in the Swan River. He was the nephew of William Diott, who is mentioned again in the Legacies of British Slavery database for his share in the plantation called Betty's Hope in St. Croix. The compensation for the Betty's Hope estate did not reach beneficiaries until 1847, well after the founding of the Swan River, when Robert's cousin Richard, who would go on to become a member of the British Parliament, inherited a share of the estate. Whether any of the profit gleaned from Betty's Hope accompanied Robert Dale to the Swan River is at this point in time, once again, speculative. However, his uncle did have enough of an influence on Robert's life in other ways. For instance, William Diot, who was also an army major, his uncles, used his position to secure Robert a promotion as ensign, and he went on to become very influential in the context of the Swan River. 10 minutes. 10 minutes. So what these examples demonstrate is that legacies of slavery, whether familial, financial, or a combination of both, operated not simply at the technical fixed point of abolition, but were present before, during, and after, and do not always neatly align with the founding of the Swan River in 1829. But rather we see these legacies that echo in the Swan River colony as conforming not necessarily to concrete evidence in the Land Returns Register, but as part of a wider and often more abstract global reorientation of networks of wealth, connection, and influence that was sparked, at least in part, from slavery and slavery-related investment and profit. So not only was there the opportunity for slavery or related or derived wealth to be transmitted to the colony later, it also did not necessarily stay in the colony. So when it became clear to many colonists that the realities on the ground in the Swan River were not one of a land of milk and honey, many looked elsewhere for higher returns, better soil and infrastructure, but ultimately the promise of better future profits. So as Statham has also observed, a total of 698 settlers had departed the colony by 1835, taking most, if not all, of their wealth with them. So this work has several main takeaways. Firstly, performing a quantitative analysis on the Land Returns Register has allowed for several key parameters to be determined. So these were the calculation of the total capital investment to the Swan River colony, the identification of the highest investments and largest grants, which when you considered together led to the identification of a significant trend of discrepancies. This carries the implication that drawing on the theory alone of 40 acres as being granted for every £3 of investment was not strictly adhered to and is therefore misleading. Secondly, I have considered these investments and early colonists as positioned and entangled within a more global economic shift around the gradual abolition of slavery. I have identified and explored which of the early colonists were granted land at Swan River and had familial and or financial links to slavery, and have found that the legacies of slavery that were transported to the Swan River were often indirect and usually connected through being sons, nephews, or grandchildren of previous slaveholders. Whether these early colonists were beneficiaries of slavery compensation themselves, or whether any of the slavery-derived wealth that was included in their initial or later investments in the Swan River is yet to be fully explored. I think this also shows how much work remains to be done for us to fully grapple with the legacies of slavery that were present in and at the making of the Swan River colony. And that's it for me.
Thank you very much. No, open the floor for conversation.
Yeah, do you want to go first, Pamela? You might have some more insight to say.
Well done, Xavier. Looking at those early applications, there's quite an education in itself. A bedstead, we gave one of the men 200 acres because of its iron content. So actually calculating the value of materials brought into this one was quite difficult, and you've done extremely well. The two things, though, most of that compensation for slavery went on in 1833, didn't it?
Yeah, but it did continue until about 2011.
It did continue,
yeah.
But it hadn't been, that massive output of money didn't happen before Swan River was founded.
Yes.
So a lot of those early decisions, I don't think were related to slave income. The decisions to come out here, number one. Number two, I found that a lot of that discrepancy that you mentioned can be explained by services. For example, Curry, and here's one of the discrepancies you mentioned, Curry helped a lot with the surveying of the waters around Swan River. Young David, who was he? Robert Dale, of course, was the explorer.
Yeah.
So, and Sterling had permission in the conditions to actually pay land for services because people who were due a pension from the British government for previous service, particularly naval or military service, could take it out in land. So he had this previous condition to actually pay for land for services in the colony, and that does explain a lot of them.
Yes.
Thank you, but I do think
That's
it's
right.
a
Yeah.
huge amount.
So like my counterpoint for your first comment was, and this is partly what other scholars such as like Jane Lyden are looking into, is that it wasn't so much that it was simply transported to the colony, given that we were founded in 1829 or 30, is that it was perhaps reflecting a wider trend of divestment. So money that was being invested in the West Indian colonies as being shifted as those industries were falling out of favour at the time. So that's what I was kind of trying to get at when I was talking about less being a fixed point. So when slavery conversation was mainly parcelled out, but it's part of a wider trend. That's how I would answer that.
Yeah, thanks, great paper, very interesting. I'm quite interested in the concrete or the material outcome of the links and the networks that you've identified. And you sort of say that it's speculative, it's hard to know. But is there any way to know? Like, do we have remittance stuff? Is there ways to track, like, family members coming out later or something like that?
Yeah, so often the missing source is something like a diary that might help. They're usually not available. So I use the land returns as kind of like an entry point.
Yeah.
Often you can find ledger books of specific individuals, but they're often a generation too far back.
Yeah.
So, for instance, one of the individuals that I don't mention is John Randall Phillips, who's also in the colony. His father was a slave owner who inherited his estate from his grandfather in the West Indies, and he left a really interesting account book of all his expenses, which included where his money went, where it came from, and that answers a lot of that question.
Yeah.
But the same can't be said for John Randall Phillips, who came to the Swan River. So often, if you look at wills, they're a really great source. But they might not specify, obviously, that this wealth from slavery, therefore, will be passed on to my son, who is now residing in the Swan River colony. They're not that explicit. So it's very difficult, and it's very difficult to move past the speculative stage. But I also think that there are more important takeaways, perhaps, that the policy price was just not necessarily adhered to, more basic level, that's a bit more concrete and less speculative.
Yeah, and I think just like the broader point of like, is this network serving a function, or is it just like the fact that they come from a rich family in general? Is the link meaningful in a concrete sense, or is it just part of it?
Exactly.
Thanks.
Yeah, the last one.
Yeah.
Xavier, fantastic analysis. Really like your use of qualification. Really addressing the criticism that Simon Bill made this morning, that this is not what historians are doing. He's gone to sleep now. But, so we can, I really hope you think about coming to Sydney to our economic history conference. I'll talk to you later about what we might do to encourage you. But I was really interested. Do you have data about where the blokes you identified, how they fit into the broader context in terms of the percentage of people who had land grants and the size of the land grant?
Yeah, so yes and no. So the land returns ledger that I'm using here is for 1829 and 30. The one that follows from June 1830 to 1832, to my understanding, is lost. And I couldn't find it in the microfilms or at the state. If anyone has it, that would be great.
So we've got one from up to 37, including the British Parliament detectives.
Yeah, right. Okay, I haven't consulted that. Yeah, this work is small, so no, I don't have it. A lot of it is not available, and then the terms also change. But there is the potential.
Just quickly, where are you at with your PhD?
I'm not doing PhD.
You're not doing that? My apologies.
Yeah, I'm just working as a research assistant for the West Australian Legacies.
Fantastic.
Jim Cameron, the question of land and its allocation is a fairly complex one, because the whole question of the original grant were not really resolved until the early 1840s. Latour, for example, retrieved his grant in 1840 and sold it to the West Australian Company as a foundation grant in combination with Sterling for the Australian settlement, the Wakefieldian settlement. Some of the others were still offloading their grants well into the 1840s. And it's also complicated in the calculations because Glenelg introduced the surrender provisions in 1837, and you can get some tracking of that through government gazettes. But also in 1829, by 1829, it was recognised that the land on Swan River and Canning River that people came to get had run out.
Yes.
So most of the grants subsequently were fragmented.
Yes.
And the fragmented bits were to be determined at some point in some point of the colony yet to be explored, which explains some of the gaps or some of the discrepancies in the allocation. So relying on land alone as an indicator may be just a bit circumspect, but I think it's a pretty good guide to jump off from.
Yeah, I agree with you entirely. And I think this is part of the problem when you're early on in a project and you're only working basically with one source. So like my analysis is limited pretty much just this source, and whether that like tracks across time when you consider those extra factors such as the fragmentation of land, this could change quite a lot. But that's why I want to stress that these findings just simply indicate that this might not have been uniform and that there are speculative issues.
I think we might have to leave it there. Obviously,
Yeah.
very topic could be discussed for a long time. So thank you, Xavier. That's I think so we've got Bill, Edgar, coming down next.
I think we acknowledge that James Stewart and the initiative, the assistance of energy, and great planning. And the family farm, of course, is Swan River Colony. But surely then the fellow settlers that came almost immediately encountered considerable problems. And I'll pass on from what's being done. And the difficulties that occurred, I actually get Matthew Powell came across the Western Australian in 1948 this year, short. And he stayed here for quite some months. And he identified what had gone wrong in those almost 2 decades. Everything was new, every arrangement was imperfect. And as on that, labour was scarce, the country was hostile, stock losses horrific, the system of land grants proved imperfect, the type of person working the land is unsuited, and the absence of powers and essential communication could compromise a huge array of difficulties. But rather than pick that all apart, what I did was I was actually given the Vivish Diary by a chap called Charles Ferguson, who the Swan Valley and so on. He was the grandson of Vivish, and it was handed to me. Vivish came with his brother in 1839, and they took up 11,000 acres at a place called Yangeddine between York and Beverley, still there, but much smaller than these days. And he actually described this dirt under the fingernails problems, if you like, feet on the ground or whichever way you like to call it. And of course, we know about the mixed farming mentality, life skills, the unfairly soils climate. It's very, very different in the valley, isn't it, from what Sterling encountered and described in 1827, first the Swan River. When Vivish and his brother first went to Yangeddine with their stock and so on, they found that the well that had been sunk by a previous investor settler had not any water in it for 2 years, because when you've got stock in that sort of arid landscape, you've got big problems. I'm told by a friend of that field that there are approximately 100 gastrolobium types of poison plants. 98 of them are in the southwest of Western Australia. And so that caused huge stock losses. And Vivish and brother didn't escape that either. And of course there was the scab disease, which we heard about. The English settlers came and they were used to hawthorn hedges, stone fences and so on from hundreds of years before, not longer. And they arrived in this landscape open. This is the era, of course, before wire had come into use. And so they had this huge problem of containing these varieties of stock, that is cattle, sheep, pigs. In fact, he describes how they actually made halters for the pigs to try and keep them under control. Here's your WA expert in pigs sitting right over there, and he will tell you all about the problems of keeping pigs under control. And you can just imagine that particular difficulty. And I'll get to the labour difficulties a little later, but Leivish, who was paying his servant he brought with him £15 a year, this fellow all of a sudden announced to Leivish he wanted £4 a month, £48 a year. And Leivish expresses his shock horror at the temerity of his labourer actually demanding the higher wages. And these things exacerbated his not. Bushfires, of course, was a constant problem, something that was certainly not used to back in the old country. Inappropriate tools, machinery. They brought with them from England the spades, the shovels, the mattocks and so on, all with this beautiful beechwood type timber in them. Of course, he remarks on the white ants having an absolute field day with this wood. Reshape it was easy, trying to get wood put into the uses, handles and so on for the shovels and picks and so on. Anybody ever tried to work York gum into some sort of shape that you could actually use? Difficult timber at the best of times. Machinery, well, he talked about the constant breakdown of his dray. Personal health, which he was a doctor, called colonial ophthalmia. He and his children both contracted this, which is, we call it sandy blight these days. It's a combination of dust, heat, flies and so on. I had it as a kid too, and I was blind for 3 or 4 days. So he and his children suffered constantly from this colonial ophthalmia, debilitating when you're trying to work this new land. Communications, his mare died. He went to Perth. He describes the journey back. He started from Guildford and he walked from Guildford to this halfway junction in the river between Walk and Northern and Chidlow, which you know today was called Chidlow Wells. These wells were every 10 or 11 miles, which I was a bit puzzled about. I know St Leonard's Well, which some of you may know, is 11 miles from York, 7 or 8 kilometres, until a person who driven teams during the 1920s pointed out to me that the distance of a fully laden dray was about 10 or 11 miles. So you had this constant procession of wells to service this sort of passage of industry, I suppose. The wells, or sort of Ronan's well in particular, would have been the equivalent of the service stations that we have today here and there. So he took Leivish a day to walk via Chidlow's Wells to the halfway point, and then another day to York, or to walk to York, which he reached in the evening, and then he attended a meeting, and then it took him another half day to walk from York to Yanchedine. So that's 2.5 days one way. We do that today, don't we, in about an hour and a half. Bishop Hale in 1858 brought his first student to Hale School from Bunbury. It took him 3 days and 2 nights camping out in Bunbury to Perth. The chap that I talked to, that I mentioned previously, he drove a horse and dray team to Southern Cross from York in 1925. And it took them 3 weeks to get there. Well, you can imagine what the roads were like in those they just tracks. The amount of breakdowns with machinery and was enormous. And of course, so the communications and the infrastructure problem, which is totally difficult, especially from the mindset from England, where these things, these communication passageways have been well established, to come to this alien landscape, this almost unworkable landscape, was something that Leivish describes quite clearly. And it's quite sobering, isn't it, to realise that many of the settlers, in fact, had these self-same problems. And so there are huge labour difficulties. I mentioned, I think, that Leivish's servant actually, who he was paying £15 a year to mine at £4 a month. And that's £48 a year. And by which was quite shocked, as I say, at the temerity of such a request. So the labour difficulties is exacerbated all the way through. And due to petitioning to the state governor and so on, some of these settlers petitioned, and eventually Governor Fitzgerald acceded to a request to the British government for convicts. And in order and council passed in 1949, they decided the British government were actually quite pleased about it was because their jails and their hogs were overflowing at the time. And of course, Tasmania and New South Wales had closed access, or Tasmania not quite yet, but on the way. And so there were conditions put to be under 45 years of age, have short-term sentences, have served half that sentence, be in good health, capable of rehabilitation. I might say that the Swan River came into being as a very conservative initiative, that in fact it was an avowed free colony. There was nothing about these earlier use in New South Wales, in Tasmania or in Queensland be inflicted on the West Australian fraternity, but needs must. Labour shortage, and so we can get competency or in the early stages of an experiment under those conditions. Well, so be it. That's right. Very much. I don't think you can talk about the West Australian convict era without having a quick look at this fellow, Alexander McConaughey. He went in 1837 with John Franklin, the new governor of Tasmania. McConaughey was something of a social reformer, and he decided to examine the punitive nature of the Tasmanian convict system. And he was quite shocked about it and wrote his opinion on it, for which he was vilified. How dare you put forward this position of giving the convicts incentive to behave yourself and so on. So eventually he was made superintendent of Norfolk Island, where all the really bad eggs went. And during that time, he instituted this system of reward for good work, for obedience and so on. And it was task related and not time related. So that these people on Norfolk Island were given privileges for abiding by the tasks given them. They were allowed to walk out, they were allowed to have vegetable gardens and so on. So it was a rehabilitative situation that he proposed. And the remarkable thing is, for the convicts who were then sent back to Sydney or back to Van Diemen's Land, the recalcitrant rate, the reoffending rate from in Sydney was 1%, and in Tasmania or Van Diemen's Land it was 3%. Just absolutely remarkable. And this was then, there was a humanist movement going on in Europe at this time too, wasn't there, in British society as well. These are the reward marks done monthly in the whole system. A 7-year man, very good, and he will be in 8 months, and so on. This bloke wasn't quite so good, but that's the program that was instituted on the hogs. I won't go all through this, but later in the Tasmanian system, as you can see, in spite of superior arrangements, vice of every description, and it was inflated. So he advocated change, and then in Tasmania, probation system was implemented very late in the piece. And that when the West Australian system was implemented, this was very much the thinking of the time, that it would be rehabilitation rather than project. So there's the 43 ships that came to West Australia in 1858 and 68. In the first 5 years, it worked very well under those provisions that I showed you earlier. Over 3,000 had arrived by 1854. 46% of them were given immediate ticket of leave, straight off the boat, processed, given clothing, food, and they were sent out then to various hiring depots. Martin Gibbs has identified 22 of them. This is, you might recognise it, there's the old brewery, and that's the common hiring depot called Clarence, which serves Perth, plus Perth Jail, and so on. Many of them disappeared quite quickly. They just wouldn't live because the labour was taken up so quickly. There are still some around today. Sean Winter has done work on the York 2J hiring depots, and it's quite interesting to read. There's an element of what's the old saying, never let the truth get in the way of a good story. You look at this and it's highly emotive, isn't it? Well, I would propose that the WA system was quite different from what had gone on in New South Wales and Dickens earlier. For example, you go to Fremantle Jail today and the cells are quite small and you think, oh, shock horror. Well, E.Y.W. Henderson, the first Controller General of Convicts, actually sent plans to the Colonial Office in London on the Pentonville system, separate confinement and so on. They were rejected by the Colonial Office because they said, and they sent back revised plans, saying that in fact the intention of Fremantle Jail is always to have prisoners in there who will be taken out daily onto work parties. They were never there. There were a few recalcitrants, of course, but they were never there with the intent of keeping them under close incarceration for long periods of time. So I'm making the point, I think, that the WA system was quite different. And then things changed. I said, I think, in the first 4 or 5 years, 46% ticket to leave straight away, straight into the community to help with labour shortage. Then the Penal Servitude Act, ironically, we all know about the 1851 Great Exhibition in Crystal Palace in London. The result being that the world beat a path to the British door for their industrial products and so on, which in one way is terrific because work went up and the crime went down, which is great, isn't it? But in the West Australian problem flow, the problem here was that the authorities worked out, colonials, I think, worked out that they needed 10,000 convicts in the jails in England to service the wharf and the jetties and the harbour facilities for the English mercantile and military fleets. And so they were short of labour. So they passed the Penal Servitude Act in 1853, which said that convicts on 4-year, 7-year sentences, the long range of criminality, would serve their sentences at home. In WA, there was a bit of a panic. They thought the convict transportation system would be cancelled. And they petitioned the Colonial Office or some did, and so it was continued. But this time, of course, a different type of convict was to come, 10-year, 15-year man, life, and so on. So the incident of danger to the community, like instability in the community, was quite high. Did it occur? Well, I've gone through quite a few ships, and I'll just give you a couple. The Nile, who came in 1857, and the Merchant. And the Nile had 64%, if you like, serious criminality, lifers, rapists, repeat offenders, and so on. The Merchantman, much the same, the Merchantman 1863. But here's a really good figure, I think, which tells a great story. The Nile had 268 convicts aboard, and only 18 or 6.7% were recorded as reoffenders subsequently. I mean, one of the 77 lifers or violent crimers never went back to Fremantle prison. The Merchantman figures were much the same. 10 minutes. 10 minutes, okay. So, which tells quite a tale, doesn't it, I think? So, according to Batty and company, the Swan River, in fact, was a fairly peaceful community. despite all the situations that might have occurred. Population distribution supervision of the convicts was close, but people like the Burgess brothers went to the 1861 Select Committee inquiry in London to make application for the convict system to continue, because they said, well, the Burgess brothers actually said we prefer convict labour, you know, their ticket leavers and so on, rather than free labourers. They're much more reliable and so on. So there's, and John Hurst, the New South Wales researcher, his view was New South Wales was a community with convicts rather than a convict community. And I think to WA, it should be in that same category too. The next phase, of course, is the Hampton era of 62, 68. He implemented a concerted infrastructure program. To that point, a lot of the convicts had gone into the agricultural areas to service this labour shortage. This fellow, however, implemented a concerted infrastructure program, sometimes called Hampton Builder, and he put in place first road between the roadway to Albany. We've got Government House, Perth Town Hall, the convict barracks, and so on. The problem is he's regarded as sometimes a negative influence in WA. Well, the thing about it is, to that point, the time to ticket a leave was 15 months. When Hampton came along, it went to 4 years. So the convicts were quite resentful about this, that before they could even get a ticket to leave, on average, it took 4 years to get one, because they were out on the work parties all over the place implementing this infrastructure program. But in 1865, for the first time, export income exceeded import expenditure, which tells a tale as well. But there were antagonisms towards him. The conservative element in the fraternity, no longer access to convict labour. Bishop Hale very much against convict transportation system, and they had personal animosity too. And the press. Now, I have to mention this press thing. Arthur Shenton was the proprietor and the editor of the Perth Gazette, and there was absolutely acrimony between them. And well, this was Shenton's view. Keep at a distance from the vulgar profanity of the crowd. Hampton removed himself. It was a personality problem. And I think probably if you're examining this period and you go to the Gazette, for goodness sake, go to the Inquirer too, because you will find there's a totally different commentary on certain events between the Gazette. So there was a personal, how Shenton got away under the libel laws at the time, I suppose that's the reason. Unfortunately, he took on the Chief Justice a little later and he was jailed. And I think his wife killed him. Yeah. I think Peter Boyce is the best swinger on Hampton. Perhaps he now deserves more honourable mention for his impressive legacy in public works and a balanced budget. His sins, personal or otherwise, having been more or less ephemeral. So just a few points. Population 5,000 to 23,000. The British government fulfilled their original intention of an equal number of 370 convicts. I think it's all of them. And the export-import figures, and the injection of Imperial funds to rescue the economy or stabilise it anyway. And then there's the social aspect. The labour shortage, of course, there was a social divide between the conservative elements and the former convicts. But I did a survey that if you lived in England as a working man and you were born before 1850, your life expectancy was 39 years. And I went through quite a few ships here, and the life expectancy, if you'd come to Western Australia born in the same time period, was 59 years, just short of 20 years longer. Family reunions were That's the tragedy of it all, of course. And their influences. Well, I will refer to this in closing. Representative government, first elections at the end of Hampton's period came in, and of course, ex-convicts now had begun to own land and businesses and so on. They qualified for the vote. John Forrest reported 1/6 of the registered voters in 1880, 10 years later, were ex-convicts. And this statement here is worth looking at too. One of the most remote colonies on the Earth's surface was not launched from mounting worldwide challenges to the traditional social order. New radicals versus the established interests. And this grew as time went on, as the ex-convicts, as I said, owned businesses and agricultural enterprises too. It's worth looking at Frank Crowley's Masters and Servants article in the 1954 early days from the Australian Historical Society. Progressive recognition of equality of rights over the next 50 years and equality between master and servants, the courts of punishment. The labourers were often tried in a criminal court, whereas the masters were tried in a civil court. And then by 1900, 1902, I think the Act, compulsory arbitration became an integral part of the way of life. And then there's a 1936 honours thesis in the West Australian the Uni Repository by John Mackenzie, a survey of West Australian politics in the period represented government 1870, 1890. And the nice thing, the beautiful thing about it is it's handwritten. It's beautifully written anyway, and it's handwritten. It's gorgeous. So have a look at that if you're interested in that evolution of 1870 to 1890. And does it matter today? And according to the national curriculum, senior secondary schools, paucity of people, paucity of courses in tertiary institutions too. Well, I love that, and this is why I think it's important, this strategic period. Daniel Hannon in 2014, this is to do with our cultural propensities even today, I think. Personal freedom, free contract capitalism, the common law are things people want to buy into. Australians took these characteristics much further. Any visitor to Australia is struck by the endurance of these characteristics, along with informality, bloody-mindedness, individualism, and self-reliance. John Stuart Mill's libertarian philosophy made flesh. Is this still Australia? And so how much can we attribute the 165,000 odd convicts that came to Australia and became independent landholders, business proprietors, and gave us many characteristics that we still have today, I think. Well,
yeah, sorry, we've been eating into your discussion time. I didn't want to do that, but there is a hard cap because the cafe shuts in about 10 minutes time. So before we race off, let's just keep that in mind. Can I call for questions now? Oh, sorry, perfect. Thank you for the presentation.
Bill, fantastic, thank you. Just two quick questions. Have you published this stuff? And if not, what are your plans?
Yes, that's the subject of my PhD. And
Legs.
hang on. Oh, there they are, 1900, gorgeous. They would have been dead if they stayed in England. And there's a couple of them.
Okay, thank you.
Bill, is the ticket of leave attributed initially to Governor Macquarie?
No, I don't think so, John. That's pretty early, isn't it, in the 19th century? The ticket of leave came about, I think, mainly from people like McConaughey and Charles Dickens. He was a great mate of McConaughey's. They together instrumental in, I mean, it was a movement worldwide anyway around about that time. Coming, I think, from the abolition of slave trade and the abolition of transportation of convicts and so on. Macquarie, I think, a bit early. But certainly he was apparently invited ex-convicts to his dinner table breakfast.
Thank you very much. One you better get us online.
Yeah.
George Lake.
Yeah.